And hello, everyone. It's good to be here with you again. And as I'm sharing screen here, I just want to say I'm super impressed with everything that Melissa and Sully are doing there at Chicago Faith and Work, and just yeah, just would encourage you that there's some really great resources there. And so continue to press in, even in this like weird COVID age where we're doing a lot online, which is not ideal for any of us. It's still, God is using them and using that time. And so just want to applaud you guys and just affirm what they are doing. And I've so enjoyed, even though our time has been brief, just having a little opportunity to be a part of this with you. Yeah, I won't rub it in that it's sunny and beautiful in Florida right now and 80 degrees and I'm in shorts like every other day, but we'll just leave it there. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit, and I'm excited about this too. We're going to talk about story. And I thought it would be appropriate, and this is in the book, so if you read it, sorry, it's a little repeat, but it would only be appropriate to talk about story by sharing a story. And actually sharing a story about a story. And so my guess is, let me get this working, that you have, well, I guess I shouldn't say it that way. Maybe some of you have seen the movie La La Land. You've probably at least heard of the movie, are familiar with it. This isn't the kind of movie that I would typically go see, but a couple of years ago when this movie was out, my wife and I went on a run-of-the-mill date night, and it was her turn to pick the movie. And so there we had it. We were on our way to dinner and then La La Land. And if you've seen the movie, and I won't give any spoiler alerts or anything, but you know that Emma Stone's character, Mia, was an aspiring actress, and she longed to make it in Hollywood, but the problem was that audition after audition, she would go and she would be turned down, and she began to think that she's never going to make it. She'll never measure up. She's never going to be good enough to make it in Hollywood. And so as the story goes, though, and as the movie progresses, her boyfriend, Sebastian, who is himself an aspiring jazz musician, coaxes Mia to do one final audition. And so she agrees to just sort of one last time, audition for a role. So she goes into this audition. She walks into this room with these two casting agents that are sitting at a desk. And if you've seen this, you'll know the scene. And the casting agents ask her to tell a story. And she thinks for a minute, and then a smile curls on her lips. And then she begins to sing this most beautiful song about her aunt from Paris, who was a dreamer, who had inspired her to become an actress. And I can remember my wife, well, I'll just report for myself, but this is true for both of us. I can remember sitting in the movie theater watching that scene. And it was something about the rawness of that scene, the beauty of that song, the intense longing that was expressed through the song. And it did something to me. It unlocked something. And so I did what anybody would do in that moment. I wept uncontrollably. Sitting there in the movie theater, thankfully it was dark. Ethel was weeping too, right next to me, my wife. And okay, so to understand sort of this weeping moment in the story of this movie, I need to give you the backstory to the conversation we had at dinner that night. Before that movie, we had gone out to dinner, and we both had a conversation about our longings and our desires. So for Ethel, my wife, for years, even before we were married, she's longed to write fiction. She's longed to write stories following in the footsteps of a Wendell Berry or maybe a Marilyn Robinson, if you know these names, or even a Flannery O'Connor, someone that evokes beauty and goodness and truth without being preachy or crass, or sentimental. But as you can imagine, the demands of raising 4 kids for my wife over the years and homeschooling our kids for a decade and then supporting me as I pursued further education, as a master's and then a PhD, she just didn't have time to explore that part of the story. But a couple of years ago, I was sort of on the other side of all that education and happily teaching and writing. And so we all kind of agreed as a family, actually, that it was mom's turn, Ethel's turn to explore the part of her dream and that part of God's story for her. And so Ethel enrolled in one class down the road at Dallas Theological Seminary, where we used to live in Texas. And it was a creative writing class. And the class was everything I would have hoped for her. She was affirmed in that class in terms of her gifting to write. She was encouraged to pursue writing as a vocation, and just everything that we would have hoped. But still that night over dinner, the doubts were surfacing and the fears were surfacing in Ethel's life. You know, what if I'm never good enough? What if I never write anything that's creative? Or what if I'm just always passed over for those that are more creative or better or brighter or younger? Okay, so that was Ethel. And then there was my story. That night, we also talked about my own hopes and dreams. And we talked about my paternal grandfather and grandmother who were actors. My grandfather was an actor. My grandmother was a musician. They lived in Hollywood for most of the life that I knew them. But that night at dinner, we laughed at how little I knew of them, and specifically my grandfather. And also we laughed at the fact that the more I've come to know about my grandfather's story, the more I've come to understand a little bit about who I am. Just to give you an example, when my grandfather died, I was looking through all his, you know, like paperwork and awards and just different paraphernalia. And this was in my late 20s. And I came across his birth certificate. Okay, so my grandfather's name is Gould. On his birth certificate, though, it had the name Zelig Goldfader. And so you can imagine, as a 20-something-year-old, you know, person, asking my father, Dad, why does Grandpa Val have this name Zelig Goldfader on his birth certificate? And so here I am, and what I learned for the first time, again in my late 20s, was that my grandfather was 100% Jewish. And his family had emigrated from Russia in 1908 and settled in Massachusetts. He was shortly born thereafter. And then when he was 16, he ran away from home all the way to Hollywood to become an actor. And if you know anything about Hollywood in the 1930s, it was rife with anti-Semitism. And so it makes sense that Zelig Goldfader would want to change his name. His first name was Hal Gould, and then he eventually changed it to Val Gould. And so here I am. You can imagine that situation, you know, my late 20s. Suddenly I learned something interesting about my grandfather, but I learned something interesting about myself. I'm Jewish. Awesome. You know, part of the chosen one. It's like, oh, and that explains why I look the way I look. I never knew. You know, people always ask, are you Greek? I'm like, I don't think so. I'm Jewish. And the more that I've learned about my grandfather, though, again, the more I learn about myself. You know, so he acted on vaudeville with Mae West, one of the sort of beauties of the day, on stage in the war. And after the war, he was part of the great operation in Europe, where they traveled with Bob Hope and entertained the troops for about, he did TV and video and movie. And then for about a decade, this is kind of interesting, for about a decade in the 1950s, now this is before social media. And so a lot of times how companies would advertise is that they would hire actors and they would travel around to high schools and speak to students. And so my grandfather was hired as the Mr. Quaker Oats man. So every time you think of, you know, the Quaker Oats man on that oatmeal box, think of my grandfather. He would literally get dressed in that outfit. And I think he spoke to over 1 million high school students that decade on patriotism and democracy, but it was really advertising for Quaker Oats. And by the way, I'm going to show you some pictures because it's fun and we can do it. So if we were in person, I would ask you if we could like talk to each other. I'd love to know if you could figure out which one is my grandfather. He uncannily looks like my father, who I uncannily look like, except they all have bigger noses as you go down the road. But my grandfather, there's Mae West in the middle, and then my grandfather would be the one on, I guess, your bottom right there. I don't know if you can see my cursor. You probably can't. I don't know if you can see that, but he's the bottom right corner. That's Grandpa during the vaudeville days. And I'm going to show you another one, but you promise you can't make fun of me about this one because it's basically me dressed up. There's Grandfather as the Quaker Oats man. And so he would travel around and do that. Okay, so that night we're talking about this. And just like Ethel had this doubt that surfaced in her life, for me, I had this other question that began to surface in my life. And the question was one of, why hasn't this more sort of creative impulse, sort of, you know, what if, you know, this call to sort of be an artist, what if that's dormant within me, you know, waiting to burst forth? And just began to wonder about that because I have some, you know, sort of somewhat creative abilities there. And so that was the backstory to that tearful moment in the theater with La La Land. We sat in that dark movie theater and we were unmasked. The story and that audition song touched this deep longing of the human heart. For Ethel, it was these deep fears and she cried. For me, it was probably this longing to live a life that matters. I don't know, I cry easily. So whatever it was, it unlocked something. But as we rode out of the theater that day and we're driving home, we were sort of laughing at the experience. And we are very much aware of the power of story. And in fact, Plato, thousands of years ago, even remarked that beauty evokes desire, right? It awakens something in us. And that's the power of story. And it touches us in a way. So art and story and beauty and the imagination are this powerful medium that touches us in a way that often bypasses our defenses and gets to the core heart in a way that nothing else does. And so I guess my thesis, if I were to have one for this just really brief talk time, is that God can use the aesthetic currency of our day, right? Story, art, beauty, dance, music, poetry, to awaken unbelievers and to set them on a journey that ends with the source of beauty himself, which is God. Okay, so I should get off these pictures here. Okay. So let's transition to story. And that's what I want to focus on for just a little time here is I want to make some observations about story. So here's actually what I want to do. I want to make 5 observations about story. And I want to use those observations to generate a definition of story. And from that definition, I want to observe some corollaries and get to the big idea of story. So that's kind of the first thing I want to do. Second thing is I just want to give you for further reading, because that's, we're learners on the way. And then I want to give you some practical stuff that we weren't able to do last time. So that's kind of the goal. By the way, and I started with this slide. I'm reading this book right now, This Tender Land, by William Kent Kruger, published in 2019, New York Times bestseller. I'm about halfway through it. Phenomenal book. But I was hooked on the first line, and I just had to throw it in here because I love the first line because it connects in a powerful way and shows the connection between story, or I should say, it shows the theological nature of story. Let's look at this. This is a first line in this book. It sold me. In the beginning, after he labored over the heavens and the earth, the light and the darkness, and land and sea and all living things that dwell therein, after he created man and woman and before he rested, I believe God gave us one final gift. Lest we forget the divine source of all that beauty, he gave us stories. I love that quote. Like I said, it just immediately hooked me. I'm sold on the book. It's been an enjoyable ride. It's kind of like a Homer's Odyssey for the modern age. But what I love about that is, this idea that stories are a gift from God, actually, like everything else in this world. And it's a gift that reminds us of the goodness, the truth, and the beauty that's all around us. And it evokes something, awakens something, and it reminds us that each one of you are called to live a dramatic life. I mean, this is the bottom line. Every one of you already live a dramatic life, and we're called to live a dramatic life, a story that's alive and that understands us, okay? And so anyway, just check out that book. I'm only halfway through, but really enjoying it. All right, 5 observations about story. And I'm gonna throw out a whole host of other books that I found helpful as I pull out these observations. And so I'll kind of give you some of my favorite quotes from each. But the first observation is that stories uniquely reveal. And this should be fairly obvious if you think about it. Like imagine meeting your future spouse. My guess was when you're, or a date or just meeting someone new, my hope is that you don't pull out your resume and exchange them to get to know each other, right? My guess is if you get to know each other, you do that by sharing stories about your life. And that's the idea, that stories uniquely reveal because they communicate in a concreteness way, that abstract principles or resumes or things can't. I love this as a quote by Hannah Arendt, who's a philosopher, but she, is pretty provocative. She says, the moment we want to say who someone is, our vocabulary leads us astray into saying what he is. We get entangled in a description of qualities he necessarily shares with others like him. We begin to describe a character in the old meaning of the word, with the result that his uniqueness escapes us. And then she says, who somebody is or was, we can only know by knowing their story, of which he or himself is the hero, his biography. In other words, everything else we know of him, including the work he may have left behind, only tells us what he is. But if we find the story in which they are the chief hero, we find their true name, right? And that's why I think we're all on a quest to discover our true name. And we discover our true name by discovering the true story of the world and locating our life in that story. Okay, first observation, though, stories uniquely reveal. Okay, number one. Number two, humans are narratival animals. This is something that sociologists, philosophers, historians, psychologists have been noting of late, is the idea that we're storytelling animals. One of my favorite sort of quotes or passages, it's actually a famous passage in this book by, I think it's all here, by Alistair McIntyre. This is a really important book called After Virtue. But this is, I forget what chapter it is, but notice what he says here. You know, man in his actions and practices, as well as his fictions, is essentially a storytelling animal. You can only answer the question, very similar to what we saw earlier, what am I supposed to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part? So notice the first point was that stories reveal our identity. McIntyre's point here is that stories reveal how we ought to act in the world as well. So not only are we story telling animals, actually here's my favorite author on story. I don't know if you can see this slide, but the book here to the right there is by John Navone. What is it? Seeking God in the Story. This is a Catholic priest, or I don't know who he is, theologian from Rome. That this book, though, is the most amazing book on a theology of story. So if you're looking for a theology of story that no one seems to know about, but I think was incredibly profound, it would be that book right there. I just want to pull this quote out, though, from Navone, just to expose you to him. But he says, our lives are shaped more by models, metaphors, and stories and myth than by abstract sets of rules and principles. We try to become certain types of persons whose way of life appeals to us. Here it is about our actions. Our actions are imitative of those individuals whose excellence and attainments please and inspire them. Consequently, they participate in the same intentionality and orientation. And so Navone's idea was that we're not just storytelling animals, but before that, we are story listening animals, that we come into the world already listening and seeking that true story of the world. So we're story listening animals, we're storytelling animals, we're actually story making animals, and that's how we understand our identity and our activity. Okay, so that's observation number two. We're narratival animals. Observation number three, it's about the gospel. And I recommend another book there on the slide by Jamie K.A. Smith. The gospel is the normative story for every human being. In other words, if we want to properly understand our lives, or the way that I like to put it, if we want to discover our true name, the only way we can do that is by locating our lives in the true story. And of course, that true story is the gospel story. So here's a great quote from Jamie K. Smith's book, On the Road with St. Augustine. Our longing for an identity is bound up with finding a story. So we don't just listen to stories, we don't just tell stories, we don't just make stories, we live according to stories too, right? So we live on stories, and then we live according to stories. And that's why the gospel is so important. And that's why in my evangelism and apologetics, one of the first questions that I ask, no matter what I'm talking about, is this question: is there a story that's alive and that understands you? In other words, is there a story that's true to the way the world is and true to the way the world ought to be? Okay, so that's number three. Number four, the gospel story reveals God to man. I won't necessarily read this long quote from Navone, but even just the first line, the life story of Jesus Christ discloses the meaning of faith, right? So and it's like the difference between systematic theology and biblical theology. We need both, right? We want propositional knowledge, and systematic theology often gives us that. But if we really want to understand the gospel story, we need to immerse ourselves, I think, in the story of Jesus's life. You know, the pre-incarnate life of the triune God, the incarnate life of the Son who took on or tabernacled among us, and then lived this perfect life, and then was crucified and died and resurrected and now ascended to the right hand of the Father. Like that is how that discloses the meaning of our faith, and also the possibility of meaningful happiness. So there's a lot we could say there, but that's maybe good for now. Okay, so that's number four. And then the last observation about story is that stories reveal meaning. In fact, I just gave a talk for Crew MIT. They're doing some outreach over the internet, and I did a talk on the search for meaning. And as it turns out, my view is that the fundamental quest that we're after when we're on a quest for the meaning of life is a quest to understand or discover our place in the universe. And that, as it turns out, is the quest to make sense of it all, right? And so making sense of it all is discovering that story, okay? And so we live into stories, and then stories, though, help us to explain three related questions. Where do you come from? Where are you bound? And what must we do to get there, right? So stories ask and answer the questions of origin, quest, and destiny, right? And how we live our life, we can actually judge a person's life, and we can determine whether he is a wanderer or a pilgrim based on how he lives his life. And those are all questions of origin, quest, and destiny, right? The wanderer lacks direction, but the pilgrim is guiding and on the path, as Augustine would say, or Jamie K. A. Smith's book said, on the road toward our true home, right? And so I love, in the tradition, there's a lot of discussion about the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. But the idea was that man is a homo viator, that we are creatures on the way. That's the fancy Latin for, creatures on the way, that we're on a pilgrim. And we need these theological virtues as well as the classical virtues to sustain us on the journey so that we can successfully reach our end, okay? All right, there's the 5 observations. Let me just pull that together to give you a definition. This is at least my definition of story. So a good story, the kind of story we long for, is a dramatic account that binds together ideas, events, images, and agents into an intelligible pattern in order to reveal deep truths about prime reality. Now, the part that's sort of italicized at the end is connected to the part in the paragraph, the parentheses, a good story. So I think that the stories that we're drawn to, the best stories, maybe the classics, we're drawn to them because of the underlying reality that they point to and awaken. And that underlying reality, I believe, is the gospel story. Okay, so think about your favorite stories. Like if I was in a classroom, before I would have begun this talk, we would have gone around and shared our favorite stories. And if you think about that story, the thing that you love about it, my guess is it's some part of the gospel story. Okay, and that's, I think, what good stories do. Now, let me just make 3 observations to get to a big idea, okay, about this definition. So I'm going to go to a new slide. Some observations. So stories are ordered accounts that reflect the order and coherence of existence itself. And so they provide, as one theologian put it, a way of a scene in the dark, right? We're thrust into this world. We're trying to make sense of the world, but stories provide a way for us to see into the dark. And, we travel with hope, of course, that there is a sense to be made of the universe, right? So the existentialists or the atheists or the naturalists, at least the pessimistic ones, they want to tell you that this world is a theater of the absurd. But I want to just hearken us back to Calvin. Remember, he says that the universe is a dazzling theater of God's glory, right? And so stories help us to seek this, is part of our God-given desire to seek order and coherence and sort of the widest frame possible. Number 2, stories have a dramatic quality to them, and I think that's instructive about what it means to be human. Like I said earlier, each of you is created to live a dramatic life. We're not meant to mediate our lives through a screen. We're not meant to live vicariously through a Netflix binge, although we all enjoy those. We're not meant, to just passively watch. We're meant to live a dramatic life. Another observation, stories, you ready? Stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Yeah, we get that. But think about each of those. A beginning, usually your beginning is this initial state of bliss. It's an Elysium or a paradise or a home or an Eden. But then there's this conflict and a journey is initiated in every good story because of the need for a successful hero's quest. And then at the end, it's a kind of homecoming on the good stories. It's a kind of rebirth or a kind of resolution is achieved. The way that I would like to put it, that at the end, we're all known by our true name. Okay, so it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but there's some important stuff that's going on. And that pulls us together to the big idea. Here it is. I believe that stories help us to reach toward theological understanding. I'll just think on that. They allow us to reach toward theological understanding. This is Urban Holmes, who's a theologian. that said that. They reach toward primordial beginnings, right, of our own lives, of the human species, of the universe itself. They reach toward this idea of the pilgrim's quest. And of course, they reach toward the renewal of all things one day, when, in the eschaton. And so our job as theologians, as apologists, as followers of Christ, as human beings, is, and really as lovers of stories, is to help others see the connections that stories are reaching toward, the theological connections, the theological ideas that they're reaching toward. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna wrap up pretty quickly because I want some time to talk. But let me give you some books, and then we'll end with some practical stuff, and then I'll open it up. So, okay. So if you're interested in a theology of story, there's a lot of good work that's out there, and a lot of good work that's being produced right now. But some of my favorites, there's a book by Alistair. Actually, this isn't my favorite book, but it's an important book because it's this idea that we can use stories in evangelism. So you have Alistair McGrath here, who's actually trying to carve out a lane for apologetics that he calls narrative apologetics, an approach to affirming, defending, and explaining the Christian faith by telling stories. So this would be a book to check out. Okay, some other wonderful works on story. I'm just going to stick with my standbys, my favorites, Lewis and Tolkien. So there's 3 important essays that Lewis wrote. If you're interested in his theology of story, one would be this essay is very short. It's like 3 pages in the book God in the Dock, called Myth Became Fact, written in 1944. The second one, a little longer story, is called this essay called Is Theology Poetry, written in 1945. You can find that essay in his book there, The Weight of Glory. And then an even longer essay a little later in 1947. It's actually called On Stories, and you can find it in his collection of essays with the title On Stories and other essays on literature. And so in these, you can catch a glimpse. Some of perhaps your favorite quotes from Lewis are embedded in these. For example, in his essay on theology and poetry, maybe you've heard the quote, I'm going to paraphrase it because I won't get it exactly right, but I don't believe in the sun because I see it, but I believe in the sun because I see everything else by it. Well, that's from his essay on theology as poetry. And so anyway, there's 3 that I would encourage you to check out from Lewis. And then with Tolkien, these would be the 2 that I would encourage you to check out as well. Wonderful, wonderful essay. I do a whole lecture on his On Fairy Stories. There's so much there that is crucial. That both Lewis and Tolkien had a theology of fairy stories, and it was brilliant. We can talk about it if you want in the Q&A. And then Leaf by Niggle. I think someone here mentioned that in an earlier week, but I love Leaf by Niggle because number one, he wrote this like in a dream, like he woke up and it was all in his mind and he wrote it in one sitting. And he wrote it during the time that he was writing Lord of the Hobbit, and he never thought that he would finish it. And just this idea that God has called each of us to paint one leaf. Like, what is that leaf? That's just going to bring beauty and order and abundance to those around you. And so anyway, it's a fictional, what I love about both of these guys is he wrote the essay on Fairy Story, and then he wrote a fictional tale to explain the concepts in the essay on Fairy Story in his essay, Leaf by Niggle. Okay, lastly, and this will be it, I'll end on this. I keep saying we need to get practical. Let me get, and this connects a little back to what we talked about last time, but this idea of how do we join with God and each other to re-enchant the world. So I just want to close with 5 practical ideas, and they're just ideas that I found helpful in my own life, and I just pass them on to you. So here they are. The first way that we can join with God and each other to re-enchant the world is just to immerse yourself in the world of the Bible. There's no rocket science there. Because in the Bible, you find the living God, right? Who's active in the lives of humans, and he's active in human history. And so enter into that story and take up your place in the divine drama. And what you will find there is a God-bathed and a God-infused world. And so, these are basic, but, habits of reading your Bible daily, or cultivating that, or memorizing scripture, which is so critical. And it's been so important in my own life because it's there, and then you just kind of chew on it and it seeps into your bones, as they say. Okay, so immerse yourself in that world. Number 2, cultivate the habit of looking for God at work in your life and in the lives of those around you. And I'm thinking of like Acts 3. There's other examples, but for example, Peter and John are walking to the temple in Acts 3, and there's a beggar, a cripple, who asks for money, and Peter stops immediately, and he doesn't give him money, but he heals him. And what's so interesting, if you read the account, Peter was actively looking for God to be at work in his life and then in the lives of those around him. And in the same way, I would just encourage us to do that. Like, God is everywhere present. He's active in my life, and he's active in your life. This is kind of that idea I shared last time about asking my kids, like, how do you see the fingerprint of God in your life? Like, that question would become natural in your life. Okay. Number 3, read books from authors who hail from a more enchanted age. So read Augustine, or read Boethius, or read Anselm, or Aquinas. Now, granted, their language is a little, the terminology they use is going to be from a different time, so it might be a little hard. Okay, fine. Read Lewis, read Tolkien in our own day. But in doing that, notice how they see the fittingness of all things in Christ. Notice how they understand life in terms of wander and return from God and to God, and then embark with them on a quest to organize your life around the good that is God. Okay, so just read quality books from those who inhabit a more enchanted world. 4th, we've got to talk about fiction, and I think the author of This Tender Land is quickly becoming one that might fall in this category for me too. When it comes to fiction, read authors who encourage us to see the sacredness of reality. I'm thinking of authors like Marilynne Robinson. She's a little harder to read. Wendell Berry, a little harder to read too. Flannery O'Connor, as well as Tolkien, Lewis, George MacDonald, just to name a few. Enter into their fictional worlds to escape from the harsh reality in this world, find consolation and comfort, and then enter back into the primary world with recovery, right? And seeing with, these proper lights. And so that would be 4th. And then lastly, commit to making and enjoying beauty and beautiful things in your life. So think about it, in the things that you make, right? Whether it's omelets or tweets or PowerPoint presentations or landscapes or bridges, I don't know what your work is, whatever it is, create with beauty in mind. And resist the temptation that is so prevalent in evangelical circles to create with only efficiency as the value, right? Or these sort of pragmatic values. And then seek to delight in the beauty that's all around you. I know it's snowing there, so take some time to walk and observe the beauty that's all around you. So it could be the everyday beauty, of which there is much in Chicago, yes, and in Florida, of a well-planned park. I mean, there's an everyday kind of beauty there. And then of course, the awe-inspiring beauty of a beautiful snow or a sunset or the majesty of the Rocky Mountains or things like that. Maybe the elegance, notice the elegance of a dance or even a baseball swing or the sublimity of a poem, thinking of Amanda Gorman, or the beauty of an act of mercy. So I guess the point is there's beauty all around. And so look for it, curate it, create it for the good of your own soul and for the blessing of others. And so I guess if I were to wrap up everything in a bow, what I would want to say very simply is just locate your life in the gospel story. Locate your life in the true and satisfying story of it all, and take part in the unfolding drama in which everything fits together in order to display the manifold wisdom and goodness and power of God. And so I guess I just come back to Calvin and this idea that the universe is indeed a dazzling theater of God's glory, and that our job is to take up our place in the play and to live the dramatic life that God has called us to live. So last piece, I keep saying last, but this is my last slide. More self-promotion. I spent a whole season in the Udo podcast exploring the question of art and beauty and the imagination. And so if you are interested in that topic, it's season 3. Again, you can find it on iTunes or Spotify or most everywhere you get your podcasts. And then we do about 12 episodes on this question of art, beauty, and the imagination. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and we can have a little discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. So good to think about these stories and how that even brings out sort of the imagination. I know I was reflecting as you were even talking. I think Leaf by Nigel is definitely a favorite, and even as we kind of explore that in the faith and work world. Tim Keller used it in the beginning of his book, Every Good Endeavor, which we refer to a lot. Um, as yeah, just how we think about our work here and now. I think that's one of the things I think about with story too, is just how it can charge sort of our eschatological imagination, you know, to help us envision the future that we're headed to. I think it's one of the things that's really powerful about story, and about imagination. I don't know if you have anything to add, to that idea, but I think it's another piece of beauty in story.
Yeah. No, I mean, just that, yeah, there's a kind of disclosive power to art and beauty and the imagination that I think we need. And so I'll just, again, to point everybody to another book, Jeremy Begbie, who's at Duke, who's a musician and a theologian. He's doing a lot of important work on doing theology through the arts. And he talks about how art uniquely points to the transcendence by being, like sort of exhaustively provocative about the things divine. And then it also, but interestingly, it helps us reveals understanding in a way that sometimes our words can't. And that's the part about story and beauty and performance and things like that that's really interesting to me. I was thinking of Stomp, if you've ever seen that musical. It's like this, vivid percussion, comedy, dance, but really takes ordinary things. And if we look at that in a theological light, I think it helps us see how even the ordinary finds its place in this divine dance where all things take up their place. And so, yeah, I think that's the beauty of art and the power of it, that we, as Christians, we own it. And so we should embrace it and think about those connections.
Yeah, it's exciting. So a few questions have come up here. Let's see. I think some of the questions that are coming are maybe related to how do you think about this specifically in maybe evangelistic contexts? Are we to talk more about like our own story, get to know their story, the story of Scripture? There's probably not one way, but how would you specifically maybe approach that topic of evangelism through this lens of story? What does that look like, or what has that looked like for you?
It's a great question. I think you actually listed in a few ways, and I would want to say all of the above. I mean, of course, telling our story is powerful because no one can deny your story. Helping them understand the meaning of the gospel story is powerful. But specifically, I think I alluded to it earlier. I've shifted in how I do my evangelism and apologetics, especially when I do like bigger, like, not that we're doing much of this these days, but when I used to travel and speak at like college campuses, when we would get on airplanes and things, I used to, like, say I'm coming to some campus to speak on, does God exist, or, the problem of evil. Typically, I think originally I would just kind of give your standard philosophical defense of that question. But in learning and thinking a lot about story, I've begun to reshuffle how I do things evangelistically. And I always begin, I hope if I'm repeating, I'm sorry, maybe I've shared this, but I do two things that I didn't do before now, just about every time I would do an evangelistic talk. And it's, here they are. Number one, I say, just for 20 minutes, will you just consider the possibility that Jesus is actually better than you think, right? That Jesus satisfies every deep longing of the human heart, and kind of list them. But the second thing I say is, I make this connection to story. So like if I'm talking on the problem of evil, the question that people want to know is, why does God allow pain and suffering? And that's a great question. But if you notice, and Keller does it so well, he taught us to like look at the question beneath the question. And what is the question beneath that question? So if the question is, God, why do you allow pain and suffering? The question beneath that is, or the intuition behind that is, this isn't the way the world's supposed to be, right? And so that allows us to ask this other question, and this is what I always do, of all the competing stories, I've said this, which is the one that's alive and understands you? Because what happens, and then I'll go do the normal stuff, the normal talk that you kind of give, but that allows me to come back at the end and say, there is a story that's alive and understands you. And in the center of that story, you have a person, Jesus Christ. So it's just this very natural way to make connections. So the last thing I'll say is I have found, like, for example, my wife is in Texas. She had a book club, and it was full of, and she's actually starting one up in Florida now, full of non-believers. And they would just read great literature, and they had phenomenal discussions, remember, because of what a good story does around theological topics. And so people are longing for stories, and people are longing to connect. And so there's some really practical ways that we can use, I think, evangelistically, book studies, sharing about movies or talks that connect to these deep truths, and then making those gospel connections.
It's so good. Yeah, I think about ways, similarly, one way we've talked about things is to kind of be aware of what false stories are being told around us. So what story, what story is culture telling us about something? What is the story that our work is telling us? I think about just the false narratives of our culture about it being all about us, or about what it takes to get ahead, or even stories that are about uh, that promote pride, or that self exaltation, and that kind of thing, and how we can tell a better story than in that. So I think that ability to kind of even identify the false stories that are being told around us, and think about how we can point to a better story, it can be so powerful in sort of that apologetic. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, just maybe about recognizing false stories or narratives, and how we combat that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll just be brief, but yeah, I mean, even worldviews. How do we test worldviews? How do we test stories? I mean, sometimes people throw out tests like correspondence and coherence, and like a pragmatic test, and I think those are good for stories too. Like, does it correspond to the way the world is? Does it cohere with itself? Is it internally consistent? And then does it, in pragmatic, like, does it answer the deep existential questions of life? And I mean, there's a lot of stories that say that, consumerism, narcissism, postmodernism, naturalism, whatever, however you want to frame your arc, or like Keller's 5 baseline narratives in his book, Preaching. These are all stories, but do they understand you? Right? That's the question. Does it really? I just finished this chapter in this book I'm writing on the quest for meaning, and kind of the way that I approached the chapter was by, we're seeking this fit between the way the world is and then our longings, like we want a true and satisfying story. And so in this chapter on meaning, I said, well, let's begin on the human side of that ledger. And so kind of listed, I'm calling it the existential set, like these deep longings of the human heart. And I list 6 for purpose, value, meaning, significance, identity, and transcendence. Like, these are 6 deep longings of the human heart. And so then you ask, of all the possible stories out there, and I kind of identify 4 big ones, how do they satisfy? And as it turns out, only one story really has that perfect fit. And that, of course, C.S. Lewis and Pascal and others have noted that we have this God-shaped void, or this lock that only the key fits in. That God is the only one that satisfies those deep longings. So yeah, I forgot your original question. I just started talking, but go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, that's great. I think, I think Lewis has helped shed so much light on there too, just even thinking about his idea that if there's a sort of a desire that we have, and we can't find anything in this world to fit it, maybe it's something from outside this world. That's a very paraphrased quote, but I think about that true with meaning too. So many people looking for purpose and meaning, and if we can't find it in the things that are around us, maybe it's because our purpose comes from outside of this world, even as we talk about those ideas of transcendence and whatnot. Good. Let's see. There's a good question came in here. I think you had mentioned it in passing, and if you would draw it out a little bit more, you talked about the idea of diving into those good stories, fictional stories, that sort of escape, and that light sort of bringing back into the world. Then somebody commented that it seems like a redemptive idea to the concept of escapism. But yeah, maybe could you talk more about what that could look like, or how is it more than just sort of an escape?
Sense, yeah. So I'm pulling from Tolkien. This idea of heroic escape. I know I mentioned that briefly. Maybe it was last week. So Tolkien, in his essay on fairy story, he talks about 3 values, I think they were, to fairy story, or functions, and they were basically escape, consolation, and recovery. I think it was like 3 chief values of fairy story. Now, what's interesting, and he says that escape is even heroic. And the reason that he gives is it's heroic because he basically says this world is hard enough as it is. Like, we need a break from it. And he says, why not escape into a world that's going to actually give you consolation, like a secondary world, that's going to give you consolation. He literally says, if you read the essays, it's going to kind of clean the windows off so that you can enter back into the primary world refreshed and with fresh eyes and see things in their proper light again. And so I think that idea is really rife. That's really suggestive. So there is a kind of escape that can be heroic. Now, not all escape is heroic, right? I mean, we can sit and binge on some show that just makes us feel worse, or we can go to Facebook or Instagram and Twitter, and we all know the studies about how that just makes us depressing. So I don't think that's the escape that Tolkien would have had in mind. The other thing I just want to say though, so Tolkien and Lewis had a theology of fairy story, and here it is. It's really cool. What they wanted to do, this is so fascinating. They wanted to awaken within you a longing for another world. In Lewis's case, Narnia. In Tolkien's case, Middle Earth. I'm a Narnia guy. Maybe you're Middle Earth. Maybe you're Hardworth person, whatever. They wanted to awaken you for a longing to go back to that world so that we would become awoken to the only other world we can ever enter, which is the kingdom of God. And so they're brilliant in what they're doing when they're constructing these fantasy worlds. They're playing, and so Tolkien in his essay, he says, fantasy isn't concerned with possibility. It's concerned with desirability. Once it's awoken the longing, it's done its it's served its purpose. And so, yeah, that's a little bit more about, and that's why I say I'm careful to put good. I don't think all stories are good like that. And so they're talking about fairy stories. I'm talking about any good story that I think connects to deep gospel themes. Those are the kind of stories that I think we can use in evangelism and enjoy in our own recovery.
That's great. That's great. I actually, I think it was from reading your book, I downloaded, you can get on fairy stories, just the essay actually in the public domain. So I would recommend that. I started reading it, but
it's tough.
But you've awakened my desire to go back and actually read that. So so great. Well, gosh, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for your good questions and for just being with us this month. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. But Paul, just thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for your time. It's just really been a pleasure to learn from you this month and bring these thoughts to mind and think about the idea of re-enchanting for ourselves, even as how we view the world, but really how we invite others into that and into this story. So it's been really good for me. I know on Wednesdays, I hope you guys have enjoyed as well. If people want to learn more about the work that you're doing, I know you've kind of mentioned the podcast, but you've mentioned that you're working on some books recently too. What's the best way for people to kind of keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, that's good. I'm trying to read all your comments here too on the side. You can come find me on social media, like come friend me on Facebook or Twitter. And that would be a good way to keep up. The books, I'm working on a book that it's due at the end of the year and you won't see it for a year and a half. So it's I think maybe I mentioned that, like it's a book of cultural apologetics, not a book on cultural apologetics. So trying to write an evangelistic book that blends all these kind of ideas of beauty, art, imagination, truth, goodness, and so on. So I'd say find me there. Follow the Two Tasks Institute as well. We will have season 5 of the podcast released soon, well, like in the summer probably. And we're also going to do a few things. We're looking like we're going to do a 4-week series on cultural apologetics in the church that'll have some pretty big name pastors that I think are important voice that are going to be a part of that maybe you can just, follow again, the Two Tasks Institute as well on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, and you can see that stuff as well. So yeah, thank you. And feel free to email me. You can Google my name and at PBA. If you ever have any question, I'd be happy to take your email and get on a Zoom or chat with any of these things.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, he's at Palm Beach Atlantic. I put the Two Tasks website again in the chat there. I know you said you're not on Instagram, but do you have a Twitter handle, Paul?
I think it's just Paul M. Gould, at Paul M. Gould.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. And I've been sending some follow-up emails after our times here. So I'll try to include some of that information as well so that you can keep up there. But yeah, this recording will be up on our website later today. I've put all of the previous messages up on the website if you want to go back and listen. We can love to have you do that. That's at faithandworkchicago.com. also all over social media and whatnot. A reminder that if you're interested in Paul's book on cultural apologetics, we have that 40% off the retail price promo code that we've been sharing. And that is only good through the month of January. So just the rest of this week, that'll be, I'll put that in the email again. So you make sure you have that. But yeah, thank you again so much for joining us here in January. A wonderful rest of your day and week, and we hope to see you for our next upcoming events. All righty, have a good rest of the afternoon. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Ollie.